Okay, it's getting started.
Okay, good to go.
Okay. Okay, so I see that a lot of people have joined. Thank you for coming to this event. This is a paper presented by John and Sven. This is about energy policy. And the title is Landowner Acceptance of Wind Farm Development in Alberta. And I think John is going to start. John, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Philippe. Thank you to everyone who's come today to join us for this presentation. And I need to acknowledge the people involved in this work. Some of the people you can see here listed on the screen, including our colleague Jürgen Meyerhoff and Monique Kolowak, who's a graduate student in our department. There are also other people involved in putting together the pieces of this work, and I will mention them as we go through the presentation today. So really happy to share some of this work with you. It's also quite timely because Sven and I are working on the paper right now, madly trying to get it finished up over the next few weeks. So we're happy to take questions, but we don't want any serious problems to be raised. Just joking there. So yeah, so looking forward to your feedback and thoughts about the approach to the research that we're doing today. I'll get right into it. I'm going to be presenting the background, the motivation, some of the conceptual underpinnings of the work. And then when we get into the study itself, I'll hand it over to Sven, who will share his screen, and we'll move through the final part of the presentation. So we hope that this takes about 45 minutes and will give us lots of time for discussion, questions after we're done. Okay, so let's start with the context. So if you're from Alberta, you know something about the kind of the energy mix within the province. We are an energy dependent province. We certainly have an identity with fossil energy, oil and gas production, but you may not know as much about how electricity generation is created within the province. And so this is a chart of the generation fuel types in Alberta, and it basically shows that the vast majority of electricity production comes from fossil energy, approximately 92%. And so one of the challenges within the province is to move towards renewable energy types of one kind or another. And that movement is being incentivized through provincial policy initiatives, more so through the previous government, the NDP government, than the government today. But there has been some initiative at the provincial level. The most notable initiative is to phase out coal by 2030. And I'm hearing recently that coal phase out will happen even sooner than that, more likely moving from coal to natural gas production of electricity. So the provincial level has some policy. The federal level, we've heard about new policy even this week for energy transition. And then, of course, with a new US president, there's likely going to be policy that is going to be affecting the North American landscape with regard to energy transition. So we can see that energy transition is happening, but looking at this pie here, you can also see that it's happening pretty slowly, particularly in Alberta, at least up to this point in time. So this is part of the context, but another big part of the context is the resource potential that we have within the province. And so these are resource potential maps for wind, geothermal, and solar. And sort of looking at wind in particular, you can see that the windy parts of the province are located south and east of Edmonton. There's a lot of installed wind power in the Pincher Creek area, which is south and west of Calgary. But you can see pretty high wind potential throughout the southern part of the province. And then east of the highway between Calgary and Edmonton, there's also a lot of wind potential in that region of the province as well. So our wind potential map is quite good in the province. And in fact, it's much better wind potential much better wind resource than, say, for example, Germany. And Germany has upwards of 30,000 wind turbines and counting. So we've got a lot of potential to grow our wind energy resources within the province. Sort of looking at the renewable energy map within the province, I have to thank Sonic Patel as well as Elizabeth Dowdle for their work a couple of summers ago. They put together an interactive map of renewable energy technologies across the country. And this is just a little snapshot of the interactive map for Southern Alberta. And you can see from this map, there are green dots as well as green triangles that represents wind power development within the province. And the triangles represent proposed projects, right? So we can see with regard to wind potential, there's a lot of proposals, project proposals on the books, but not a lot of that has been developed to date. There are obviously some new projects underway, but development is relatively slow as well. So we know that there's a kind of general movement towards renewables within the province. We can see it in the electricity mix, but one of the positions of this work is that energy transition is slow, has been slow, and is likely to be slow within the province for a number of reasons. And this lack of transition has something to do with sort of the economic and financial conditions of the province, as well as technical issues around grid connectivity and other things. But it also has to do with regulatory, institutional, and social context. It has to do with people. And so this is where we see some resistance, some concern with regard to further wind power development. The first thing I'll show you is some slides that demonstrate, compared to the general population, rural landowners are much less supportive of wind power. And so I'm just going to show you quickly a couple of slides to illustrate this point. This is survey data that we collected a number of years ago. It's a national survey with 3,000 respondents. And we asked the question, to what extent do you support or oppose further development of the following energy sources in Canada? And not surprising, in this general population survey, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal are the most popular sources of energy in the country. And you can see coal is at the bottom of the list there with the least amount of support. Now contrast that with the data that we're going to be talking about today. So this comes from our data set that Sven will talk about in more detail in a few minutes, but you can see here that rural landowners in Alberta, when they're asked the same question, look at the way in which support for these energy sources is distributed. You can see that in a comparative way, wind has less support than coal, marginally less support than coal, and slightly more support than nuclear power. So when you look at the rural landowner, they have a variety of concerns around wind power. And some of the previous work that we've done in this project, our previous study with one of our graduate students, was looking at the sources of opposition. And these sources of opposition I've summarized here. They relate to the newness of the technology and the fact that the landscapes are changing. And that has an impact on people in terms of their norms and expectations. The development of wind power also has impacts on neighbor relationships. So there are impacts on communities that are felt in terms of how these projects are developed. There's a sense of loss of identity and a loss of dependency on the fossil energy sector. So a sense that, if you support renewable energy, if you support wind power, then you have to be against these other technologies, or you're assumed to be against these other technologies. And so there's this kind of tension with regard to where your loyalties lie. There's also concern around behavior of the landmen. These are the project proponents, the people working on behalf of the project developers, who are negotiating leases with landowners for wind turbines on their land. And the behavior of those landmen have been called into question in recent years. There's a concern around a lack of regulation, particularly at the end stages of projects, and similar to orphan well problems, there may be orphan turbine problems in the future if there's not sufficient regulation. And then there's a degree of skepticism around climate change and the need for this kind of new technology on the landscape. If you don't have concerns for a changing climate, if you don't believe we're in a climate crisis, then what's all the fuss? Why are we, doing this in the first place? So these are some of the sources of concern, sources of resistance to wind power that we've identified in previous work. So this brings us to our research objectives. So the research objectives for this study are really to identify and quantify factors associated with the acceptability of wind power development, and specifically looking at the rural landowners. So that the data we have is from rural landowners. And distinct from issues related to the economics of wind power, financial issues like lease payments or property values, or the physical aspects of how these projects are designed, like how many wind turbines are there going to be and so on, we're specifically focused on these social and institutional aspects. And I'll describe briefly some of the motivating concepts here in the next couple of slides. So what we're doing is we're focusing on these social components, and these components have been identified in the literature. I'll share some of that literature with you in a minute. But although they've been identified in the literature, we haven't really seen much work that tries to quantify or assess these social components within some kind of research or experimental empirical design. So that's what we're also contributing, is we're taking these social components and bringing them into an experimental design. So looking briefly at the components, the first concept that sort of is driving a lot of the work, this concept is motivating not just for this particular study, but motivating for a range of studies that our graduate students are working on within this project. And that first concept is community energy. It was defined probably most precisely, initially in 2008 by Walker and Divine Wright. And it is composed of sort of two dimensions. There's a process dimension and as well as an outcomes dimension. And so community energy would be sort of oriented around sort of open and participatory processes, more inclusive processes. And it would also be oriented around more local and collective outcomes. And so the further you move into those quadrants, A and B, on this slide, the further you move towards something that looks like community energy. But we also recognize that, it's all of the projects that we might imagine are in some ways on a continuum of these dimensions. And so we can characterize individual projects in this way. So that's one of the sort of organizing concepts, and you'll see some elements of this concept in our research design later on. Just a few more points about community energy. We can see that from a community energy perspective, there's a focus on endogenous growth as opposed to exogenous or growth taking place from outside the community. In this sense, there's a connection to sort of community level investment, democratization of the energy system. So that's one of the sort of underlying concepts here. And then there's a focus on local institutional designs or typologies. And in particular, this study pays particular attention to the idea of cooperatives. So cooperatives as a mode of local ownership, as well as municipalities as a mode of local ownership. And so so we take inspiration from the work that these authors have done on these particular concepts as well, and we've embedded them into our research design. And then finally, before I hand it over to Sven, who will take it from here, we also are interested in the idea of justice, or taking from justice theory a couple of concepts. One of them is distributive justice, the fair distribution of benefits, as well as procedural justice, which relates to inclusion, information, and decision-making. And so these procedural elements, as well as the distributional elements, are identified as important aspects of implementing wind power projects. These are issues of deep concern to the people who live in and around and who host wind turbines on their land. And the photo that I've provided here is from Ontario. And the work in Ontario is illustrative of these concerns, where wind power has been developed there. It has been very controversial, and a lot of this controversy has stemmed from the lack of perceived justice in the siting and the development of these projects. So we take inspiration, we take motivation from these particular concepts and embed them into our research design. So I've given some background in terms of the context, the motivation, and some of the conceptual underpinnings for the work. And at this point, I think I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to Sven, who will take us into the specifics of the study. You're muted, Sven.
Thank you, John. So my job will be to tell you more about how we implement the background, so the context and the hypothesis that John was just talking about, and how we collected the data and how we conducted the analysis. So our study approach is based on a survey that we conducted online with the help of market research company Kinetic here in the province of Alberta. And our target population for the survey are rural landowners, which in Alberta predominantly means commercial farm operations. And we only have set two parameters for selecting these participants. So there's somebody who needs to own land and has a minimum of $10,000 in revenue on that land operation. And that makes these participants mainly farms. So Kinetic is a commercial market research company that operates worldwide. But what they offer here across Canada is a panel of multiple dozens of tens of thousands of farms across the country that are part of an online panel for agriculture and animal health sort of research and marketing purposes. So this is a really good panel in terms of getting access to otherwise hard to survey population, which is farmers, not just in Alberta. So we structured our questionnaire as follows. So we first asked people about, where they are located in the province, what types of forms of land ownership they have in their agriculture operation, whether they have any form of energy installations, so those pump jacks or solar panels or possibly a small windmill. We asked them about the support for energy sources, the graphic that John also presented already to you. We asked them about their perceived importance of the sector to Alberta. And after that, we asked them about different views and concerns they may be having with wind energy and its development in the process. So directly asking them to express their feelings and concerns and values around that. We asked them about trust in different stakeholder groups related to energy development in the province, general views on the energy industry as a stakeholder in that sector, the extent of place attachment, their climate perceptions and climate-related beliefs, environmental values, community identity, trust, and general demographics information that also describes not just themselves as individuals, but also their role in agriculture, so whether they're decision makers on the farm and so on. The key innovation or the key aspect of that survey that allows us to identify the objectives, so measure levels of acceptance, preferences that landowners have around wind energy development, we implemented with a factorial survey experiment that was actually placed very early in the survey to not get people to think too much about the topic that we wanted to explore. And so I'm going to talk about now a little bit about how we designed a factorial survey experiment. Before I do that, here's just an overview of where our respondents, we had 401 participants, where they are located. And you see they're pretty much nicely located along where the wind potential in the province is pretty good. So that's east of the Highway 2 corridor, Edmonton, and further south. And of course, because we have agricultural landowners, we also have that contingent in the Peace River region where agriculture, commercial agriculture is pretty strong in the province. So a factorial survey experiment or a vignette experiment or vignettes is a research tool that basically comprises short, and this is an official definition, almost short, carefully constructed description of a person, an object, or a situation that represents a systematic combination of characteristics. So it is basically a text-based description that provides a vignette or sort of a visualizable description of a situation. And we thought that this would be a very suitable approach to provide people with scenarios about possible wind developments in their vicinity that would trigger some of these responses that we are trying to identify and quantify here, as opposed to just ask people survey questions about what do you think about X on a 5-point scale and a more traditional and pure survey approach. So vignettes or factorial experiments are a pretty established social science method that over the years, especially in the field of sociology or psychology, has been found to be really efficient and effective in measuring levels of fairness, justice, and social norms. And since those are the concepts that we really like to evaluate here, this is a very good, well-fitting sort of instrument to get at these issues. Expressed in a different way, vignettes are just another stated preference methods, just as like we see choice experiment or other conjoint analysis stated preference methods for trying to elicit responses to hypothetical scenarios, and here in this context, certainly multidimensional or multifactorial scenarios. And the process of evaluation that makes vignettes different from standard sort of discrete choice experiments that many of us will be familiar with is that they use a rating scale as opposed to a binary yes, no response mechanism. They are great in the sense that they allow us to mimic almost a real life situation by providing a very descriptive environment. But they're not constrained by having sort of generating monetary trade-offs to say, you know, do you rate something highly because the revenues are high, or do you rate something not so high because there's a high cost associated? So the typical trade-offs that economic choice experiments and other stated preference methods generate. But on the other hand, because they're a bit more comprehensive in the way they describe scenarios, they can also be more cognitively challenging for participants. So that's sort of the trade-off here. Surprisingly, they have been developed in the late 1970s and are very prolific in the social science literature, but they're still somehow new in economics work and also in relationship to energy. So there's a paper in the American Economic Review. Many of my colleagues will be thinking, oh yeah, in 2017 that uses vignettes, and that's the only paper, well, no, that's the only paper in a very high-ranking economic journal that I could find notions of vignettes. And then a study by Liebe et al. 2017 is the only paper that we are aware of by our co-authors, our colleague Jürgen in Germany, that has used a vignette approach and sort of in the study of an energy topic. And so we use this approach to really characterize and measure the preferences that individual landowners have. And with the vignette, we're able to uncover what would typically otherwise be unobservable. And that is sort of these social factors that drive the acceptance or not of siting proposals. So we're not wanting landowners to evaluate actual scenarios like wind turbine placements and sizes, so more these technical economical factors. We really want to get out these perceptions and acceptance levels of a potential proposal that might be happening in their vicinity, in their municipality. So because vignettes are not something that I think many of us are really familiar with. So here's an example of a vignette from a 2018 study in labor economics or labor economic application. And in this study, HR managers are presented with hypothetical short form CVs for applicants for apprenticeship positions. And they're given this information, and then they're asked to respond whether, you see that in the red box, how likely is it that this applicant will be invited to the next step of the recruitment process on a scale from 1 to 10, so very unlikely to very likely. And then participants in this sort of study would see multiple sort of short CVs with randomized varying attributes in terms of the items given here, and then all these observations would be rated, and then researchers would analyze, so what makes the characteristics of these apprenticeship applicants that makes being invited to an interview most likely. Here's an example from that study that our colleague Jürgen was involved in, an energy policy from 2017. And here you see a description, a verbal description of a wind turbine facility or park, more along the lines of sort of technical, techno-economical descriptions. So not only distance, but also the number of turbines, the use of the electricity that will produce their tax revenue and other attributes. And here respondents are also asked in terms of their acceptability of this proposal on a scale from 1 to 11. And so here's the design, or here are the attributes and their levels that we are analyzing in this vignette experiment, that are basically taken from the background that John described, or based on the background knowledge that John described, and also sort of things that have been studied in the literature, like John was referring to, that are of specific interest to us, and also specific of interest to the Alberta situations. So it's the ownership structure that is that we describe as a municipal, so a community-based ownership structure, a local cooperative ownership structure, or a purely private utility-driven investment. So this pure corporate corporate ownership structure, that would be the status quo today. We also include context, because this element of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is certainly also strong in not just with residents, but also with landowners. So we distinguish here between on the other side of the county, so far away, as far as I'm concerned, directly on my property or my neighbor's property. Different forms of compensation that are one of the most researched topics in sort of how wind energy developments may overcome elements of resistance by compensating for the burden that residents and neighbors will have to face when wind installation is taking place. So here we distinguish between no compensation, some compensation, and sort of an element of fairness and equality by having equal compensation for all those landowners that are affected by the proposed development. And then the next three attributes are the ones that very closely relate to the conceptual aspects that John has been mentioning, and that is the levels of inclusion that are sort of a spatial representation of who's going to be included in the conversation about the wind proposal, the level of influence, other than just being informed and having the opportunity in a town hall to express concerns, the ability to potentially sway or to potentially even cancel a project based on resident and landowner opposition. And then last not least, different levels of access to information that range between complete confidentiality between sort of the local municipal decision makers and maybe the project proponents, and then some information available and at the most full public disclosure almost of the relevant information to the residents or the entire municipality in question here. So here's one vignette example sort of taken from our draft paper at the moment that gives you an idea of how we implement these attributes in their respective levels in the form of a vignette. And I try to highlight here in yellow, it's not a very good job, the elements of the text description that will be replaced and randomized as we go along. And so with each of these vignettes, we ask the respondents to evaluate the situation on a -5 to +5 scale. So we use a different scale here to evaluate these responses. So we basically provide an anchor point of neutrality in the middle. And we ask, given the situation and the assumptions that were stated before, and I need to tell you what these are, how acceptable or not does this wind energy development sound to you? So before respondents, within the survey, before we let them loose on this vignette assignment, we provided them with a bit of a cheap talk script to take these proposals as serious as you can take a hypothetical proposal, as to avoid them to just dismissing this as just a written text that is not non-consequential to them. And we also, because we learned that concerns over environments, the birds, the bats, and the bees, and other sort of almost misperceptions of what energy installations can do to wildlife, noise, and diseases in humans and animals and so on, we provided a little bit of a priming text to individuals to not worry about these sorts of effects on the environment and humans, and also not to be concerned about the overall economic feasibility and other related effects that a wind park might have on their community. so that people would be more focused and more engaged in the attributes that we wanted them to be engaged in and evaluate, as opposed to having these other thoughts that they may already know about in mind when they make these decisions. So in the way a factorial survey experiment or vignette experiment is implemented is very similar in the way we as researchers, as economists, would design a discrete choice experiment. And so from our 6 attributes and 3 levels, each of our full factorial design of the study is a 3x6 equaling 227 unique text descriptions of vignettes with complete randomizations of the 6 attributes and 3 levels we have. And in order to reduce that design to something that's a bit more manageable and a bit more logical in terms of engaging people and not overburdening them with all these many combinations, we use an orthogonal design allowing for two-way interactions between the attributes that we chose, and they vary independently of each other within and across vignettes. So there's no constraints of which attributes have to go together. We could think about maybe inclusion and having a say in a project to be sort of maybe related, but we didn't want to make any of these assumptions. So we have a strict orthogonal or fold over design in order to reduce from 729 vignettes down to 144. And that is our sample of vignettes that we had evaluated by the participants. We choose, as I said, we choose a level point centered rating scale. And this is something that is quite sort of prominent in the methodological discussion of the use of vignette experiments. You can think of, why didn't we ask people to rate on a scale from 0 to 100? And why not on a 5-point scale? Or why not have people actually use a lever on the screen of their computer to set a level of acceptance? We believe that a sort of centered scale of plus and minus was pretty appropriate, and we had seen other studies using that successfully as well, so we followed this approach. So the implementation in the survey means that each respondent, we have 400 respondents, was given 6 randomly drawn vignettes from our sample of 144. And that resulted in 2,406 evaluations of vignettes, which means each vignette was roughly evaluated between 16 and 17 times by all our respondents, which gives us a pretty good sort of variation in individual vignette ratings. So for each vignette, we have basically 17 evaluations, which is sufficient in terms of statistical means to analyze how differences in the vignettes affect acceptance and vice versa. So with vignettes, because like in choice experiments, we have to think about certain issues that are going on in terms of what this means for econometric or model estimations. Because the 6 ratings by individual will be clustered with the individual, so we need to account for that. And that's why it's advisable to at least use ordinary least squares with cluster robot standard errors when estimating the effect of attributes or any other respondent characteristics on the respective vignette ratings, which is what we are interested in. We want to explain which attributes of a vignette ultimately influence a higher rating, so which contribute to a higher rating, and which other attributes consistently maybe are less preferred and therefore lead to a lower ranking. But because also, so we have clustering around each respondent in their evaluations, but we also cannot make the assumptions that all of these respondents have similar preferences. So for instance, some individuals may be really sensitive in terms of fairness, and that means that they will respond to perceived unfair vignettes differently than other respondents. So we also have to account for that variation, and therefore it's advisable to use a random intercepts or a version of a random effects model that accounts for differences in the intercepts that people will be having in terms of thresholds for different attribute preferences. And the results I'll be showing you will basically be the random effects models, because they go beyond the clustering and give us a better, more robust estimation of these effects on vignette ratings. So here's a little bit of information of our sample. So we have 104 rural landowners, and you see, gender is highly biased towards male, but our survey is distinctly different from the census of agriculture in Alberta. So we actually have more women operators than Alberta would otherwise percentage-wise have. Our respondents are slightly younger than the average rural landowner in Alberta. You can see there's 281 identified Conservative Party affiliators, That makes our panel fairly conservative out of 401, which is to be expected here in Western Canada. We have a pretty good balance between pure crop producers and also livestock producers. Not that it necessarily matters in the context of wind turbine placement, but we just wanted to have different forms of agriculture production system represented. What's interesting here is our producers in terms of size are on average almost 3,000 acres. That makes them more than twice as big as the average Alberta farm, which is around 1,200, 1,300 acres. So that means we represent a more commercially oriented land holdings in the province. So more agriculture commercially interested landowners. Hi Pia, ich habe deinen Snack dahingestellt. Ich habe mein Meeting. Ja, kannst du auch. Okay. Sorry, that was my daughter. And then you'll see there's actually a likelihood of fairly close to average likelihood of installing wind renewable infrastructure on individuals' farms. So there's a likelihood, an expressed likelihood that that might happen. People generally find the Alberta energy sector to be very important to them. People have a so-so more than median knowledge or stated knowledge about what wind energy means and what it's about. And then when we go to climate concerns or climate, the importance of climate concerns in the province, we tend to find that more conservative leaning landowners or agriculture producers are a little bit less convinced that we are in a climate crisis. And they're also a little bit less convinced that moving into renewable energy development will be a solution to the climate crisis. So again, perceptions or preferences are such that people would rather see a continuous growth of the oil and gas sector as opposed to a quick and fast transition over to renewable energy systems. So that goes in line with what John has been saying earlier, and it's sort of the feeling that, is this really necessary? Should we be really putting all of our eggs into possibly into the wind turbine nest? Okay, and so what we also wanted to learn, even independent of using the vignette technique, is how do people feel about the potential impacts? And I alluded that we used sort of a primer, a bit of a script to push aside some of these concerns about effects on property values, visual effects, noise effects, and so on, effects on wildlife. But what we do find is that actually a lot of people, a lot of the landowners are concerned about these potential and hypothetical effects, proven or not. And it's quite surprising that the fairness of the compensation mechanisms, so what will be the process by which I will be compensated for having to put up with the possible effects on property values, with visual impacts, with noise and other sort of issues, seems to be topping the list of concerns. Changes to electricity prices or health and safety concerns, well, rank lower, and that's great. And of course, landowners are concerned about impact on farming. So how many curves do they have to go down their pieces of land to not run into turbines? That's certainly an issue. So, but the compensation process and the fairness process seem to be really looming large in terms of potential impacts. The majority of our respondents say they have seen or heard a wind turbine before. That is correlated to them, many of them being in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor and probably having driven by or through Pincher Creek at some point in their life. So there's a good chance that everybody will have seen a turbine there. Only sort of 60, 70 out of 400 have yet been approached by a wind energy developer, by one of these landmen that John was referring to earlier. So people have heard and seen, but have not necessarily been involved in that process. And so our hypothetical scenarios are probably the first time they're confronted really with us having to make sort of a decision or an evaluation of such a potential scenario. So here's our results. So out of the 2,406 evaluations that we had from our 401 respondents, this is the distribution of the ratings that they have given back to us, where on the very left hand, we have completely unacceptable, and on the very right, we have completely acceptable, so fully acceptable and for it. And you see that we have, I find it hard to describe, evaluations are all over the place. We have a little peak in the middle. We have a very peak on the left-hand side, and we have like a clustering around a +2 or 3. What's what's captured in dark here are responses where the individual has, over all 6 vignettes, has given the same response level, the same rating. So especially on the -5, you see that 180 respondents have consistently said -5 to any vignette, independent of which attributes and levels were, sorry, which levels of attributes were presented to them in the vignette. And on the other hand, 54 individuals have said +5, so you complete 2 thumbs up to anything that we have shown in terms of these vignettes. So those are open questions for us, how we should delve deeper into these respondents. We just identified them as protest votes, where protest just means they want to get some form of message across, be it positive or negative. We don't quite know yet. So here's a visually attractive presentation of our econometric random effects model results. And we basically see sort of the middle line here is 0. And then you see to the left, moving black bars to the left is a negative, is less support, or a lower influencing a lower ranking of these vignettes, and coefficients going to the right means a higher level of support to the individual attributes. So this model is basically just including the attributes of the respective vignette, meaning how does the presence of a certain level, how does the presence of a certain attribute level in the vignette influence its average rating? Meaning, for instance, ownership structure is if the vignette had the attribute municipal ownership as opposed to, or relatively speaking, to private, which was our benchmark, then the vignette on average had a 0.28 score, a higher ranking as opposed to when this attribute was not present. And you see, if you go down that list, so local cooperative ownership was the most preferred, or the highest positive influencing attribute of ownership structure. When it comes to location or spatial context of the turbine or the wind power installation, then of course people had the highest preference, or were giving vignettes a higher rating if it was proposing that this installation would be, as far as away in my community as possible, so across county. When it comes to compensation, people preferred a proximity-based compensation system as opposed to everybody gets the same level of compensation relative to no compensation whatsoever, which makes sense because people do realize that if I'm close, I want to see a different level of compensation as opposed to neighbors that might be further away from this wind park. All landowners expressed strong positive preferences for forms of inclusions that were going beyond just the landowners that would actually see wind turbines installed on their land, where the stronger preference is actually to including specifically the closer or the closest neighbor to the installation, and not necessarily, but still, if possible, all sort of landowners or all residents in the county. Influence is interesting. We were thinking, I think we were hypothesizing a little bit that people would want to have a higher level of influence, being able to sway or possibly say no at all to the wind developers. But what we see here is that level of influence is actually significant and negative for the medium, a little bit of swaying, and 0, so not effective or not important at all when it comes to actually wanting to cancel a project. So this is interesting. Maybe John can chime in later to share his interpretation. I would interpret it but I don't have much evidence to go with it, that people are not necessarily feeling that they should be responsible to making these decisions. Maybe they would actually refer that level of decision making more to their elected municipal leaders, as opposed to feeling the burden of having to decide on something that potentially has very far-reaching also economic consequences. Access to information, again, that makes a lot of sense, is appreciated, as opposed to having exclusive and therefore no forms of public access to the outcomes of this development process. So I wanted to show also a second model here. So what I've shown in the previous slide is basically the results of model number 1, which is the econometric model that just includes the attributes and their levels. But a second level of analysis in this random effects model is also to include attributes of the respondent or characteristics of the respondents themselves. And what we see here in the lower box, landowner characteristics, is actually the extent to which the characteristics of the respondents themselves influence the average rating of different vignettes when we control for the attributes already. And you see that many of them are highly significant. So one that I would like to pick here is that people that stated higher levels of concern about climate change have a significantly higher rating on average of vignettes. So by 0.65 sort of points to the positive side, so closer to +5. If people have expressed some support, and we call it excitement, for wind energy installation as a potential solution to climate change, but also just as a viable and wanted energy resource, then this effect is also very significant. It's a 1.8 move on the rating scale. We ask about experience with wind energy. Unfortunately, that coefficient is insignificant, and therefore we cannot draw much of a conclusion. And at the very bottom, people that feel a bit more liberal in their political views are also a bit more endorsive of proposed wind energy proposals, given their social and community factors. So just to summarize, what do we find? We find that local ownership matters, particularly if it's organized in a cooperative style. So people want skin in the game, but they want skin in the game in sort of in a collective fashion, as opposed to potentially a multinational corporation, a multinational player that comes in and plugs this wind development down. People have expressed preferences for an equity-based compensation system in a spatial sense, that the closer you are, the more you should be compensated, which makes a lot of sense. Having a say is less important. In my interpretation to date is that I think that people want the right decision makers, the elected or those that are ultimately should be held responsible to make those decisions. So keep their hands clean of potential mistakes, I guess. But we also see that community ownership itself is not necessarily the single most important driver of acceptance levels or of preferences that landowners may express. So as a summary statement, we would want to say that wind energy might be more palatable to Alberta landowners if sort of the footprint in the communities is considered and sort of incorporated into the planning process, and especially if the community has the ability to express and influence that process sort of as an important stakeholder group. So the models we have presented is sort of a standard operating procedure for dealing with vignette experiment data. And I just wanted to close with maybe posing a few questions that we would have some alternative sort of econometric or analysis solutions for, which probably could give rise to another paper from this project. So something that we haven't thought about, but that might be interesting, is that we ask people to make rating decisions in a sequence of 6 different vignettes, but we all treat them the same, as if the 6th vignette could be the first vignette or the 5th could be the second. But what if somebody reads the first vignette with a different level of attention or a different mindset than the last vignette? So that would give rise to the issue of ordering effects. And therefore, maybe we could consider each vignette as an independent decision process, and therefore find out whether the valuation of these vignettes is actually a question of when they were presented, whether they presented first or last to these individuals. Is there a learning process maybe that we are not aware of? Or are people maybe forming these protest votes very quickly by reading the first one, giving it a ranking, and then just sticking with this ranking because they get upset with us? And ultimately, what we really have been scratching our heads about a lot is who's behind these protest votes? Why did people give these uniform, positive, medium, and very supportive statements? Can we explain where they're coming from and sort of how we can profile or characterize them a little bit better? Because we have the data. Our model so far just hasn't given us the opportunity to do that. So I have 3 options here for further data wizardry a little bit that would possibly allow us to explore these issues. A big part of this project is the communication of what's been done in this project to reach out to not just research colleagues to papers, but also to community members. And therefore, this infographic stands exemplary a little bit for what we're trying to do in this project and reaching out to Alberta landowners and to the Alberta public in terms of kind of communicating the signs of energy transition to the public. My daughter is getting on my nerves here. I got to throw her out, sorry. But thank you very much. And this is bringing my part of and our part of the presentation to an end. Thank you. And we hope we get lots of questions that we have good answers to. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I guess we can always pull it up again if and when we need it. Is that how we do it, Philippe?
Yeah, good. I would encourage anyone who wants to ask a question to.
I have a question.
Yeah, Sandeep.
Okay, Sven and John. Okay, it's unmuted. All right. So, you know, it's a question and a comment, question or a comment, and maybe you can link up to what I'm saying with your thoughts with your own thoughts. Sven, you mentioned in the beginning of your talk that you said, you know, we're going to use you propped up the idea of using vignettes, that it has not been used, and I know this is work in progress, but I think maybe you can prop up what is special about the use of vignettes in your study. Okay, what does it? You talked about identification. What does it help to identify? So maybe, right, and you gave a little story about it. Maybe an outside perspective of vignettes, outside of energy. Okay, I'm going to tell you the way I understand vignettes, and maybe that will give you some ideas how to nail this down for your particular application.
Sure.
So, Sven, do you want to answer that, or shall I give you my opinion and then you can address it?
No, go ahead. I want to hear your opinion first.
Okay. So a very naive way. So let's say anytime we ask self-reported questions, it is prone to something called differential item functioning. Okay. A great example of that, let's say you and I ordered chicken curry, right? And they say spicy, medium, or mild. Your spicy will be my mild because our latent spice scales are very different, right? Because, and you can apply that to environmental values, cultural differences, why my spicy is very much higher in that latent dimension than yours, and all of that, right? So the problem is this, the identification problem here, then you cannot compare answers across individuals, right? Because they'll say, one person says something, the other person says something else, but they're actually both saying mild or both saying spicy. The scales that are observed are very different than the scales that are latent, okay? So typically we correct for that using different methods. One of them is item response theory, okay? Once you apply that, you have different things like discrimination and difficulty parameters. You take that, you adjust your questions and you play with your questions so that you remove the things that are conflating these individual responses. There are assumptions that are involved that you check those assumptions if they hold. The other method is the use of vignettes, right? So, and there are other methods away from vignettes also. So I'm saying that, do you have, I mean, motivating your approach in this way is more satisfactory, one. Second, if you couch it in that way, then that will force you to check for the assumptions for when you're using vignettes, if those assumptions are satisfied. It'll also give you hints in removing or changing some of the questions without doing a new survey, so that that individual heterogeneity, right, in meaning, in understanding the scale goes away. And I think what you're doing with the random effects is also a solution of getting rid of those individual specific meanings associated with the scales. I hope that, I don't know, that's my comment / question. Do you know, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think I can follow, and I'm not sure whether you're criticizing what we did or whether you just have a different way of sort of maybe pitching it, presenting it. I like the word couching, right? I like the word couching.
I'm just thinking that I didn't hear anything about why vignettes are special and what they help you identify, and that's fine, that can be added. But if you follow this approach, there might be assumptions that you need to check, okay? Because this is a well laid out method, and it's sort of a plug and play that, okay, these are some like difference in differences. So you got to check if the parallel trend assumption holds. So just like that for vignettes, things you got to check, and there is some homework to be done, that if the vignettes show you some signs that, oh, these two particular vignettes were very conflating, they just really screwed up, they cannot differentiate between individuals, and there's some homework to be done based on that.
Yeah, no, the very last point, we did a lot of checking, and we do not find any vignettes where people were really confused. And otherwise, I probably would have used very different words, but the advantage of the vignette is to not couch people into binary, I like this or I don't like this. We could have taken these attributes and formed discrete packages. This is a project, and this is a project. Which of the two projects would you like, A or B, or opt out, like a classic simple discrete choice experiment. But then if we would have done that, we would have not allowed for people to express, or you would have not acknowledged these underlying differences that you're speaking to at all. And I think that's the strength of the vignette approach, because we're not trying to measure preferences for product attributes like a red apple versus a green apple with a price attached. We are trying to measure things strictly on perceptions and social norms of concept of, you know, influence and distributive and other forms of justice that have been looming large in this literature, but not a lot of people have tried to quantify how the differences between individuals and how they feel or where they come from. And you described it as mild. You know, mild and mild can be two different things. And I think that's the strength of the vignette approach. We don't have to, we can actually let people express their level of mild, or, you know, I like it, I don't like it, independent of exactly knowing what they mean with it. But our attributes, I think, are clear in the sense that people can understood them. There was no confusion about that. And so they could provide a ranking. We did not force them. And I think that's the main advantage of vignettes. They're not forcing people to make binary choice decisions. They provide you with an expression of a preference. And that's why typically in vignettes, you use wide rating scales of, you know, 10 or 11 points. And there's these notions of why not use a 100-point scale, but there's obviously cost, because, you know, people may get lost in a 100-point scale in expressing how they feel or what they think and how they accept. But that's the strength, and that's why we use it, to let people express a preference that is not binary. And I think then embedding this in the survey, we did it embedded, and we collect so much additional information that I think we are pretty good in explaining, in being able to explain where people come from. And I mean, I've only shown one result with these level 2 variables with these respondent characteristics, but that's certainly something that we should explain further to test whether there are any sort of characteristics of these respondent that, I don't know, that allow us to better explain why some of them really turn into a different direction, why they are so negative or so positive. Does that answer it?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add, like, there are some standard things, like when you use vignettes, like checking for response consistency and vignette equivalence. These are standard things that you can do to see that your vignette approach was able to control for that differential item functioning, or the different meanings people attach to different things. The original problem you started with and you're trying to identify.
Yeah, I must admit we have not done that level of checking, but maybe we really should. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Any other question? I'm sure there are. Question to John are also acceptable, huh?
Of course. Would anybody like a wind turbine in their backyard?
You have one for sale?
Oh, I can get one. There's a couple in Germany they're selling right now.
Probably the old ones.
Sure. I think that rusty brown might just fit nicely as a backyard structure.
I have a question, Catalina Solano here. I was wondering, was there any concern about wildlife? And that's maybe another factor that landowners were concerned about in terms of having birds or bats being killed by the turbines.
So maybe I'll answer that one in the slides. Sven showed one slide, the level of concern for wind farm impacts. And at the top of the list was fairness of the compensation payments. And then pretty much close to the bottom of the list is concern for the effects on the local environment or ecosystem.
Okay.
So that gets as close as we can, I think, to the question you're asking, Catalina. So there are concerns. For example, about 40% of the population said that they were very concerned about ecosystem effects.
Yeah.
But relative to a bunch of other things like property values and fairness of payments, it's not as significant. The one thing that I take from these results, or this slide about concerns, is that the level of concern is pretty high across all of these areas, right? So the red part of the bar represents very concerned, and there's a lot of concern across all of these different issues.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe the experience with abandoned wells is part of the reason why they fear that history is repeated with renewable energy?
Potentially, but I don't think so. I think that most of the concern comes from reading online and learning about other places. So there's been, for example, a lot of concern about how things have developed in Ontario, for example.
Yeah.
And so they'll read about Ontario. And so if there's a general level of discomfort for wind turbines, then there's a process of searching for information that confirms those concerns, right? So that's what we're really hearing from people mostly.
And it's also interesting because people who have a very strong beliefs in a certain issue, they often really good at finding research and information that supports that belief instead of something that challenges that belief. So
right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, one of the things that, that we've learned from other parts of the country, for example, in Texas, there has been a lot of wind power development in Texas. And so landowners there, we would assume, have very similar kinds of backgrounds, sort of oil and gas kind of landscape, agricultural landscape. But wind turbine development has taken place there. And I think partly it's because, they've found a way to sort of see the opportunity, right, as an owner, as a landowner. And I think that's part of what we're trying to get at here is, what kinds of opportunities as landowners might motivate people to say yes more often or more quickly to the development of wind turbines.
Yes.
Thank you, Catalina. Any other questions?
Maybe, John, you should tell the story about the Friends of Science or the Friends for Science to maybe bridge while people are thinking about the next question.
Yeah, let me just check to see if Friends of Science are here. Don't see them anywhere. Yeah, so a few months ago, we published a project report and posted it on our website and did some advertising based on the survey results. It was just descriptive statistics. But we motivated some of the project results around what farmers were telling us in terms of their concerns around wind turbines, and we talked about how many of the farmers are landowners are influenced by this organization based out of Calgary called Friends of Science. And Friends of Science is an organization that believes their primary belief is that climate change is caused by sunspot activity. So their story is mainly along those lines. And so as a result, if you believe that argument, then there's no point in sort of doing anything about climate mitigation on the planet, because it has nothing to do with what we do on the planet. And so we characterized the Friends of Science within our report, and they opposed or objected to our characterization of them in the report, and they wrote a letter directly to the president of the university, Bill Flanagan, and then posted that letter on their blog, so it's publicly available. And so we haven't heard anything from them since. We don't know if there's going to be any further action from the Friends of Science, but they were very perturbed at the way we characterized them within our report. And it just, maybe it goes to show how sort of politically sensitive, this issue is for some people, and Friends of Science are sort of very influential in the thinking of many of the landowners that we talked to in our study.
Any questions?
I was just thinking about another question here, Catalina again. I was wondering what kind of demographic or characteristics do you collect that you could see, oh, people who, I don't know, well, usually age it's like something that we talk a lot about, but maybe political beliefs, maybe is that something that drives people to be more distrusting of renewable resources, or or the use of their land for that objective.
I mean, Catalina, we have from the sample table and the charts we have been sharing, and my first slide about what's in the survey, the questions, we have a lot of that information. We haven't been doing these bivariate correlations or looking at, how does conservative political affiliation relate to what energy sources are preferred, but some of that is already known, I think, from other research, how most residents, but also how landowners might be leaning. The interesting questions are here are, to what extent some of these characteristics and responses to the other survey questions that we have not been including in these models so far, would they help us to explain maybe some of these answers on the ends of the distribution? So for instance, people that really strongly feel about climate change in one way or another, would they be more likely to be on the tail ends of the distribution, where we have a lot of responses in ratings of these vignettes?
And I think it's, Catalina, it's also I think interesting to note that in the second order variables within the model, we do have a variable for liberal as well as conservative, and it looks like in both of those are positive. So if you're on both one end of the tail, if you're extremely liberal or extremely conservative, there is more support for turbines in both cases, right? And I think one way of explaining that extremely conservative view is almost into a libertarian kind of argument of energy independence, right? So this is one of the arguments for renewable energy from a very conservative perspective, is sort of, not being dependent on others for, your electricity needs, having local independence, for example. So those variables are embedded within the structure of our models at this point.
No, that's very interesting. That both extremes are supportive of it.
Are positive, yeah.
Yeah.
There's some interesting, I think I heard an interesting blog a while ago about the case in Texas that John was referring to. And in fact, the arguments that have been catching on with rural Texan landowners with wind energy and getting them to install these turbines were get off the grid, which is basically capping the relation, capping the government, cutting the bonds to the government, or what is perceived to be the government, the electricity that comes off the grid, and generating economic revenue. So you get a turbine, you don't have to deal with the government because now you're autark, you're independent in terms of energy, which is otherwise kind of difficult, right? And you can generate economic revenue. And then all these perceived leftists and other arguments were all of a sudden out of the window. And that goes kind of nicely with what we are finding. So conservatives would consider energy, wind energy, and that doesn't get out in our survey so much, but maybe preferring it if the economic arguments are put in the right way. And more liberal leaning landowners might be more wanting to contribute to the social good, the public good, by fostering energy transition. But the concept or the proposals that we have been putting to landowners here are not so much about, would you want one turbine on your property to power your chicken barn? It's more about, would your community accept a larger wind park with 10, 50, 100 turbines, which is a different concept than the cases that we also find in the literature about individual independence and individual preferences for having that technology on your property.
Jillian, you have a question?
Not a question, it was just a comment, just because I come from a rural area where there is proposed turbine development. And I found it really interesting that the financial pieces seem to be like the most salient things that came out as concerns. But when I'm talking with a lot of the folks at home, you don't hear that, because I guess people don't talk about finances, politics, and religion, but they're always talking about, oh, well, the death of the birds and the headaches, and the orphan well one has come up now as a more common talking point. And just that there's a difference between their public and private thoughts in terms of perceptions of the developments.
Yeah, I remember sort of, so John and I and two of the graduate students, Monique and Sasha, we did a little tour with our collaborator Jürgen when he visited in 2018, sort of in preparing the study, and we came across a few notions of the fact that the existing developments for wind parks in the province have been causing a bit of a stir in some areas, in some municipalities, because the landman or supposed landman, the project developers, have been approaching farmers and asked them to not reveal any of the information from the lease agreements or those payments to keep the option of the development open to their friends. And then, you know, the long and short of it is that somebody ran into somebody in Tim Hortons and said, hey, guess what? I got paid $5,000 for a couple of pieces of my land to keep them open for wind turbine development. And there happens to be a neighbor who only got paid $2,000 for basically the same contract. And there has been a lot of so frustration and expressed frustration and disappointment about the unfairness of that process. And I think it looks like because that sector is not as regulated, or the process is not as regulated yet in comparison to the landman for the oil and gas sector, that have to follow very specific guidelines when talking to landowners, that this has been exploited, and that seems to have caused a lot of I guess frustration and also negative views of that entire process of having wind turbines in the municipality.
Yes, and one of the other concerns in that individual negotiation, which each farmer separately, other than of course like some getting a better deal because they were better at negotiating, is maybe the lack of understanding of how is this infrastructure going to be reclaimed at the end of life. And a lot of landowners probably didn't know that when they started accepting all the wells, or even if they knew it, sometimes the wells were kind of imposing their lands. But this is a big issue too, because it requires some good understanding of the infrastructure, what can be salvaged, what cannot be salvaged, what the cost of that would be. And I think it's kind of unfair to expect for a landowner to be able to have all the information to make a safe or like like a safe deal for themselves, or a good deal for themselves, make sure that they're covered in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And one of the problems has been the lack of regulation, and the government has been working on developing more regulation. But there when we were in Pincher Creek, we talked to the project operator there, TransAlta, that have a lot of wind turbines. And he was saying that the process of decommissioning of turbines would involve removing the tower. And then, of course, there would be a large concrete or cement base in the ground that would stay, but they would cut the top of it off and then cover it over with soil so that it could return to agricultural production or productive use. So it seems like there is a plan in place. One of the challenges there, of course, is that these large kind of projects can change hands, right? And when they change hands, yes, then there may be sort of some shirking of responsibility. And so that's obviously the same issue that we have with orphan wells too. And that's one of the issues that many of the landowners talk about, is that with these private companies, many of them are from offshore, international firms, they come and negotiate lease payments, and they secure the rights to develop a turbine farm, a wind farm, and then they sell the whole thing off to a new company, right? So the people that you negotiate with are not necessarily and likely not going to be the same people who you work with to develop the farm. And so that sort of constant changing of hands is also very disruptive and really erodes trust, in the relationships with the landowners.
So Germany is mentioned very often as one of the leaders in wind energy development, and yes, it has over 30,000 turbines. But I had a chance, what is that, 2019, last year? Yeah, last year, the year before last year, I had a chance of visiting a few wind turbine places across Germany. And it turned out that Germany also did sort of forget a little bit in the regulatory process about the decommissioning process. And they have municipally owned wind turbines. So all of these concepts that we're testing here and starting to think about here, they do exist in some parts of Europe already. And what I learned is that, well, somebody was saying casually that the farmers or the landowners shouldn't be so concerned about what happens when the wind turbine is abandoned, because the scrap metal value of a turbine shaft, because usually the motor falls apart and is taken away, the scrap metal value of a regular turbine shaft would be about $100,000, just the metal itself. And I thought to myself, well, that's probably going to be a lot of comfort to the landowners, having a 50-meter tall metal stock standing on their farm that's worth $100,000. But how are you going to monetize that when it's standing there?
How are you going to put it apart so you can bring the material?
Who's going to take it with their truck and bring it to the scrapyard?
Yeah, it's not as simple. It's really not as simple.
And also there's about, I think, 30 or 40 tons. So tons, that's about the volume almost of a regular house. That's put into the ground as a footing for the turbine. So the removal of that first meter is going to take a bit more than the regular stump grinder from Home Depot to get rid of.
Exactly.
So the economic cost of the decommissioning, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in terms of what it costs to renaturalize an oil and gas well, but I think there's significant.
I don't think anyone knows.
So yeah, there's a lot of suspicion. I mean, this is a new technology. There's a lot of change involved, and so landowners seem to be really suspicious about, and therefore emphasizing all these concerns that that could be taken care of in a good regulatory process that unfortunately doesn't really exist yet completely.
That's correct. Yes.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, I think one of the problem is really the regulatory process. I mean, there's no often, well, I mean, and also the possibility of removing these wind turbines when they are old. I mean, it can be arranged. I mean, there are some law you can design contract. You can make people responsible for that. You can force people to put money aside. I mean, it's largely a political problem, and politicians basically would take their responsibility and enact the right regulation to do that, right?
Yeah, but there's also I mean, this is a bit off topic, but there's also the literature talking about the frenzy in the renewable energy market these days, and just trying. When these turbines are built, they're sitting around, they need to be installed. And if you look at the auctions, for the capacity auctions we have had here in the province with 3.5 cents, there's a willingness to put hundreds of millions of dollars into these projects that will probably only generate a real return on that investment in many years down the road, because the prices of the electricity that these bids have been accepting are so low that on the energy itself, you wonder how these projects are ever going to make money. And so politicians are caught between we need to be participating in getting wind turbines here because there's a lot of supply, and who doesn't want to be sort of taking advantage of the low cost supply. But on the other hand, who wants to be responsible in the end, and who wants to have the signature associated with costly removal processes, right? If I was a politician, I would want to make big announcement for wind turbines and the employment that they provide and how cool they are. But I don't want to be ultimately the Alberta energy regulator who has to take, charge of the first decommissioning process, or, companies abandoning, or the first turbine that falls into a cow because it burns out or something like that, right? Mm. And Germany, places in Europe, across Europe and Germany at the forefront, there's a heavy push back now to wind energy. After clapping everybody on the shoulder how awesome Germany is in leading the renewable energy transition, all of a sudden people are scratching their heads and nobody wants turbines anymore. And there's funny stories in Bavaria. A community has successfully abandoned an almost shovel-ready project because there was a wind turbine that was blocking the view to their church. And so the Catholic Church was getting involved and said, how can you sort of, spit on the image of the beautiful representation of the dominant religion in Bavaria, and therefore the wind park was not accomplished because the Prime Minister of Bavaria said they're going to put regulation in place that a wind turbine cannot be any closer than, I don't know, I have to make this up a little bit, but 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers from a church. Like the most ludicrous regulatory decisions are being made, in such a contentious discussion.
If it's an old church.
It was a pretty church. I saw a picture of it. I'm sure there's many more of those. I mean, think about southern Alberta when you drive down Highway 2 and you look to the west. Eventually, past Red Deer for us here in Edmonton, you see the mountain ranges becoming bigger and bigger. And isn't it beautiful? Or as you drive from Calgary or from Red Deer, when you drive west and the Rocky Mountains keep rising and rising and rising. What would happen if you would put down 2,000 or 1,000 wind turbines in the foothills, where there's a lot of wind, right?
I have some friends where people have. My mother actually was a mayor of a small village, and she was threatened. I mean, almost physically, right, to basically back down on a project that she was promoting, and eventually she abandon it because the prefect of the region tell her, okay, it's not worth it. So, I mean, it's, yeah. Any other questions, reaction, comments? Okay. Don't be shy. Okay, we're almost at the end anyway. So, thank you very much, John and Sven.
Thank you.
That was a great talk, good discussion. Next week we will have Bruno presenting on the endogenous ELF. So that's going to be interesting as well. If you feel free to email these two professors if you have further question. So I will see you next week with Bruno Wishman for some research on endogenous ELF. Thank you very much to everybody, and I hope to see you next week.
Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Stay
everyone.
happy and healthy.
Bye.
Hey, that was good, huh?
Sure.
Yeah.
I thought it was good.
Maybe you can stop the recording.